The Babylon Project was our last best hope for Scott. A self-contained podcast, 1 hour long, located on the internet. A place of fun and discussion for Babylon 5 fans everywhere. A shining beacon in cyberspace, all alone in the night. It was the dawn of the 20th anniversary of Babylon 5, the year the Great War to free Bab 5 came upon us all. This is the story of the last of the Babylon podcasts. The year is 2014. The name of the place is the Babylon Project Podcast. Now, the host of the Babylon Project podcast, Jim Arrowwood and Raul Wybera.
Hi there, this is Jim and Raul, and you are listening to the Babylon Project podcast. Try and say that 3 times fast, my friends. So how you doing, Jim?
I'm doing great. It's a weekend. I've had a day off, gotten over all the ills that I've been suffering, and feel great. I'm ready to do this.
Same here. I know both of us have had our bouts of the bugs floating around, so we've had plenty of booms over the last couple of weeks. Folks, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is the 20th anniversary of Babylon 5. The original series had started in, 1994. Can you believe it's been that long?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can.
It seems like, I remember sitting in front of our little, Anthony and I hadn't been married that long, sitting in front of our little 20-inch cheap Emerson television, watching the first episodes back when we lived in California before we got to come back home. And it is totally different now rewatching the show on a big 50-inch plasma.
Yeah, well, I know what you mean. We had a 19-inch TV and had to sit pretty close to see stuff, you know.
Yep. Because of that 20th anniversary, Jim and I have decided, with a little bit of encouragement from some of our friends and neighbors online, that it would be an absolutely wonderful time to sit down and rewatch the entire series, and to sit down and have some conversation, have some thoughts, look through some of the stories that have happened. And that's because, at least in my personal opinion, I don't know where Jim would place it, but for me, as a series, Babylon 5 is still to date the best written, beginning to end series that I've seen on television so far. There's been a few shows that I've had hope, but they haven't had that rock-solid consistency. What are your thoughts, Jim?
I would have to agree. Very well-written show, as we have discussed on numerous occasions. As you know, I am a Trekkie through and through, and this is one that I made room for and had absolutely no problems making room for Babylon 5.
Well, actually, if you know Jim, you know he's not a Trekkie, he's a Trekker. He's definitely reached the elite level here.
Oh.
So, just a little bit about the history for Jim and I in setting up this podcast, and I'm sure Scott won't mind us talking about that. We kind of broke in, borrowed, Joe the cook had this window open, and we snuck into the sci-fi diner and whipped up a big heaping batch of Babylon 5. Apparently, it got pretty good It got a pretty good response from what I understand. From what Scott told me, it is now the number 8 downloaded show. I don't know if you heard that.
Yeah, he mentioned that the other evening.
And if you're not listening to the Sci-Fi Diner, you're really selling yourself short. As far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, it is the best general subject science fiction podcast that is out in the internet today.
It is pan-galactic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know Scott's not going to mind a shameless plug for him here, especially with all the help and encouragement he's given us getting this started.
Yes.
We're here to talk about Babylon 5, so let's go ahead and talk some Babylon 5. The podcast in general, what we're going to do here, as I said, it is going to be sort of a reminiscing. It's going to be some in-depth discussion. The thing is, if we're going to have the kind of discussion that this series requires, we are not going to be a spoiler-friendly podcast. You have any problems?
No, absolutely. This is going to be a spoiler-heavy podcast. So, thinking about it as a 20-year-old show, we feel we have the right to spoil.
Yeah, if you haven't watched Babylon 5 by now, Scott, it's your fault. You need to get up. You need to get in there and get caught up. Now, that's not to say we're going to go out of our way to try and ruin things that are happening ahead, of course. It's more like the show is just so cohesive. There's things that we're going to talk about here just in this pilot. Well, actually, it's more of a pilot movie.
Right.
We're going to be talking about things here that are not going to be addressed for seasons in the future. Part of the beauty of the show is you see things that were done in 1 year, and 3 seasons later, you see the payback for what he did at that point. So it's impossible to really give an honest discussion, a frank discussion of the show without having some of those conversations ahead. And that means spoilers just can't be avoided.
Right. Exactly. So we're going to do a show by show, blow by blow discussion of this. And hopefully we'll get some listeners and get some comments coming in and expand our show and make it better as we go.
Absolutely. Well, folks, tonight what we're going to be talking about is the episode The Gathering. The Gathering was the pilot for the series. As with most pilots, it's very much, just feels unfinished when you can, especially when you compare it to the main series. Yeah. And you can really tell in the pilot more than anywhere else. You can tell in the pilot the lower budget compared to a show like Star Trek or or DS9. The pilot actually aired in February of 1993. And that was literally 11 months because the main series started in January of 94. So it was almost a year gap between the two. That meant they couldn't get all of the same actors. There were changes and stuff that had to be made in set and costume. But in spite of all of that, there is just an absolutely amazing consistency in the story and setting when you go from the pilot to the main series. And that'll be a big part of what we talk about.
Yeah, am I also not mistaken that there are a couple of versions of the pilot, at least a couple of versions of the pilot out there? For instance, the one that I watched, I downloaded from Amazon, is said to have less material in it than the pilot that is seen mostly today if you buy, say, a DVD box set.
You are absolutely right. I believe there's several minutes more material added. They remastered all of the graphics, so there was a bit of a step up on the graphics. And I don't remember who did the original music, but they went to Chris Franke, who did the music for the main series, to do the music, to do the score for the pilot of the series as well. And
I've got to see that version.
So the version you saw did not have Franke's music.
No.
This version that we're seeing, I mean, you can think of it as a director's cut, actually, I guess. It was done in 1998 for TNT. This actually is some good historical background, some good historical setting for the show. At the time Babylon 5 came out, Star Trek had really set a new standard in one regard that had nothing to do with science fiction. It had to do with TV in general. And that was that was shows being released in syndication. In the early 90s, that was pretty much a new thing. Babylon 5 was released as a syndicated show with something called the Primetime Entertainment Network. Babylon 5 was one of the premiere shows. Kung Fu The Legend Continues was another one of the big premiere shows that started. Well, that model kind of fell apart around the fourth season or so. After it didn't last very long. It lasted 3 or 4 years and kind of fell apart. But, of course, now lots of shows are released in syndication and are picked up by the main networks. In fact,
yes,
one of our favorite shows, This Is Where I Got to Know Jim, Fringe, was produced and made and owned by Warner, but released on Fox. So even competitors are cross-doing shows.
Yes.
This was a new thing for Babylon 5, though, this whole syndication. And like I said, that model fell apart. To get to a fifth season, the series was picked up by TNT, and they invited Straczynski to do what he would consider the ideal cut, the master cut. And that is the episode of The Gathering that most people see that was made in 1998.
Yeah, I got to see that one of these days.
It is absolutely worth seeing. There's a few things in particular that do not happen in the episode that you saw, in particular, something with Kosh, and we'll discuss that a little further along.
Yes.
And we've talked a lot about this episode. It might not hurt, just as a reminder, if you haven't watched it in a while. Jim, if you could go ahead and give us a summary of what happened.
Archive. Access. Initiated.
As the title suggests, this is a gathering of officials that are going to make up the main members of those that are going to confer to try to keep peace in the galaxy. After the Centauri Republic's ambassador gives a few opening remarks explaining what the space station Babylon 5 is, a transport arrives carrying Lita Alexander. She is met by the station's commander, Jeffrey Sinclair. They are unknowingly being watched by a shady character named Del Varner. In the station's operations center, Ambassador Jakar of the Narn Republic enters, obviously agitated that a transport ship with supplies for him is unable to dock because it has to wait for weapons inspections. Shortly after, a small craft departs from the transport, lands on the outside of the station, and cuts a hole into the hull. While Commander Sinclair sits in a garden, he receives a visit from Delenn, the Minbari ambassador. She gives him a chip with information on the Vorlon race. In the operations center, the crew is alerted that the Vorlon ambassador Kosh is arriving 2 days earlier than expected. In another place on the station, Varner welcomes a visitor that cannot be identified. As the door to Varner's quarters close, a shot is fired. On the station's core shuttle, Sinclair meets with Station Security Chief Michael Garibaldi. Sinclair tells Garibaldi to make sure that Mollari is present to welcome Kosh aboard the station. Jakar stops the station's second-in-command, Laurel Takashima, and tells her that his transport can wait and will submit to weapons inspections after all, then walks away, whistling and singing. Garibaldi tracks Mollari down in the station's casino and gives him Sinclair's message. As Garibaldi leaves, Varner approaches Mollari and asks about his foolproof gambling plan. Kosh's ship docks inside the station. Sinclair's elevator stops while he is on his way to meet Kosh, and when Kosh enters the docking bay, there is apparently no one there to greet him. A few minutes later, Sinclair, Takashima, and Garibaldi arrive to find Kosh lying on the deck. The station's physician, Dr. Benjamin Kyle, orders Kosh moved to sickbay for treatment. In sickbay, Sinclair is informed that Kosh's environment suit is not to be removed under orders from the Vorlon government. Sinclair orders all recordings to be stopped, and Kyle examines Kosh through a small opening in his suit. An unnamed senator from EarthGov wants to know what is being done to learn what happened to Kosh. He informs him that Garibaldi is heading up the investigation. The senator doubts Garibaldi's ability to do the job, but Sinclair backs Garibaldi. While Garibaldi begins his investigation, Sinclair goes to his quarters for some rest and finds his off-and-on girlfriend, Carolyn Sykes, there waiting for him. Dr. Kyle works on an analysis of Kosh's condition and finds that he has been poisoned and that his condition is terminal. Sinclair immediately shuts down any traffic to or from the station in light of an attempted assassination of Kosh. Meanwhile, G'Kar meets with Ambassador Delenn, blaming Mollari for the assassination. Delenn is not convinced, and G'Kar becomes agitated, complaining that he doesn't understand why the Grey Council, or the ruling body of the Minbari, would stop a war just as they were about to win. Delenn has enough of G'Kar's rant and puts it to an end by using a device that is a ring on her finger, holding G'Kar silent and in distress. She tells him that he is never to mention the Grey Council to her again. Dr. Kyle calls on Lita to use her telepathic abilities to scan Kosh. She first refuses, but is finally convinced that it is necessary to find the assassin. In the operations center, a drop in pressure is detected, and a maintenance robot is dispatched to investigate. The ship that is attached to the outside of the station destroys the robot. Varner meets someone he apparently knows entering an elevator. As the doors close, a shot rings out. Varner doesn't exit the elevator, but the worker he met does. Back in sickbay, Lita scans Kosh and learns that he saw Sinclair put a poison patch on Kosh's hand. In his office, Sinclair is told that Kosh might be able to be helped. The senator calls and tells Sinclair that he is to remove himself from the investigation and orders Takashima to convene the council. The council convenes and G'Kar questions Dr. Kyle. G'Kar then questions Sinclair and accuses Carolyn of bringing the poison on the station. Privately, G'Kar then approaches Mollari, saying that he wants to discuss his vote when the council reconvenes. Sinclair and Garibaldi discuss Varner and his past criminal record. Garibaldi also expresses his total distrust of telepaths, and he goes to confront Varner. Upon arrival in Varner's quarters, Varner is discovered dead. When the council reconvenes, G'Kar says that they don't have the authority to prosecute Sinclair, but the Vorlons do. A vote is taken, and G'Kar and Mollari vote to let him be taken by the Vorlons. Takashima votes no, and Delenn abstains. G'Kar votes on behalf of the Vorlons, who vote yes. So Sinclair is to be sent to the home world of the Vorlons. A repair crew is sent to see what happens to the robot that was destroyed. Garibaldi and Mollari discuss the vote, and Mollari explains that he would have voted no, but G'Kar threatened to reveal certain secrets that could harm the Centauri government. So Mollari agreed to vote yes. Carolyn and Sinclair visit. Sinclair talks about his role in the Battle of the Line, in which he becomes unconscious when trying to ram a large Minbari ship, and wakes up later to find the Minbari have surrendered. Lita goes to sickbay and inquires about Kosh, but she starts turning off all of the life support systems for Kosh while Dr. Kyle is distracted. He sees what she is doing and turns a laser on her. As Lita flees sickbay, she runs into Sinclair and the real Lita in the corridor. The faux Lita flees. The crew sent to check on the robot discovers the ship attached to the outside of the station and brings it in for inspection. Sinclair and Garibaldi learn that it is a one-man ship and that someone has been on the station without being detected. In Varner's quarters, Takashima discovers that Varner brought a changeling net on board, a device which would allow someone to change their appearance at will. A very large Vorlon fleet then arrives at the station to pick up Sinclair as he and Garibaldi leave to find whoever it is that is doing all the mischief. Garibaldi is wounded by the suspect and Sinclair goes to arrest him alone. The Vorlons threaten to open fire if Sinclair is not delivered to them soon. Sinclair catches up with the suspect, who appears as a maintenance worker that emerged from the elevator. As they battle, the suspect changes his guises into those who he has imitated while on the station. During the fight, Sinclair shoves the suspect into a power grid, shorting out the changeling net, and it is revealed that the changeling is a Minbari. When Sinclair tries to question him, the Minbari tells him that he has a hole in his mind and activates an explosive device embedded in his arm. Meanwhile, the Vorlons begin powering up their weapons. The explosive in the Minbari's arm detonates, causing a hull breach, sending the station off its axis and threatening to cause catastrophic damage. Sinclair barely escapes being killed by the explosion, and the Vorlon ships rapidly clear the area of the station. Sinclair is cleared of the charges and goes to sickbay to check on Kosh. Sinclair is approached by Delenn, who gives him a chip with information on who and where the Minbari assassin has been. Sinclair meets for drinks with G'Kar, tells him that he knows that G'Kar was responsible for bringing the Minbari on the station and arranging for the changeling net. G'Kar denies everything and flippantly tells Sinclair that there is no proof of his complications. Sinclair then tells G'Kar that he has swallowed a nano-tracking device that will operate for 5 years to keep track of him. Sinclair and Garibaldi have a good laugh over duping G'Kar, as there is no nano-device in G'Kar, but he doesn't know that. There is a reception to welcome Kosh on the station. When Sinclair takes a break from the party, he is joined in the garden by Delenn, where Sinclair questions her about the knowledge of what happened to him at the Battle of the Line. Delenn becomes nervous as she evades his questions, and they rejoin the reception.
Initiating plot analysis.
Thanks, Jim. That was excellent. Now,
Thank you.
that was a little longer than the typical summary, but this was really a 2-hour pilot. So
Right.
It was almost a made-for-TV movie. But it sets up everything for the show and where it's going to go and how it's going to go.
Yes.
I think one of the first things we need to talk about in that regard is probably the cast, because Babylon 5 really was a character-driven show on the one hand, but it was also equally a plot-driven show.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't sacrifice one for the other. And because of that, we really need to run down the cast.
Yeah, we can quickly talk about, I would say probably quickly talk about who would be coming back to start out with in the series. And Michael O'Hare playing Commander Jeffrey Sinclair.
Right.
Jerry Doyle, Security Chief Michael Garibaldi. Mira Furlan as the Minbari Ambassador Delenn.
Just as an aside, a lot of people that I know think about Mira Furlan and her role in Lost. That's what they get all excited about. If you really want to see Mira Furlan at her best, absolute best, you need to watch Babylon 5.
Oh, yeah. And then continuing, Peter Jurassic as Londo Mollari, the Centauri Ambassador.
With the big hair.
And yep. Andreas Katsoulas as G'Kar, the Narn Ambassador. Well, that would be everybody that would be seen in the first season.
Right. Now, Patricia Tallman as Lita Alexander, she's sort of a special case. She couldn't come back for season 1 because of other engagements. Mm-hmm. And was in and out, I believe, a few episodes of season 2. And It wasn't until season 3 that she did come back as a regular through the end of the series. but there's some characters that were important in this first episode that didn't come back as well, right, Jim?
That is correct. We have Tamlin Tomita as Laurel Takashima, who played the second in command.
Correct.
And she was replaced later on by Claudia Christian as Susan Ivanova.
Right. Now, Tamlin was not really comfortable with the character arc. She did not really want to return for the show. The arc was going to be such that she was going to be a traitor or a mole with a implanted hidden personality. That was how Jakar was able to get security codes and stuff to get through. And in the revised, in the director's cut version, she wasn't quite so obviously questionable. I understand that in the version that you saw, it left a little more question about the character.
Yes.
All right. Now, those character elements were sent to other characters in the series, and we'll see that as we go along.
Right. The doctor, station's doctor, Benjamin Kyle, was played by a gentleman named Johnny Secca.
Correct. He could not come back for health reasons.
Okay, and, well, there it is. That would be the main cast. There were a couple of guest stars in this one. John Fleck, who my fellow Trekkies would recognize as playing a prominent role in the series Enterprise, the Suliban named Selleck. And then there was Blair Barron, who played Carolyn Sykes, the love interest of Jeffrey Sinclair.
And frankly, I love the actress. She's fine, but I didn't like the character that much. I personally like Catherine Sakai, who came in a somewhat similar role. I really like Catherine Sakai's character much better.
I have to agree. Did Catherine Sakai, though, she only showed up in a couple of episodes, didn't she?
Yeah, she was not in a lot. No, Catherine Sakai was such a popular character that she became a focal point of one of the Babylon 5 books. If you have not read To Dream in the City of Sorrows, that book, which was, I believe, written by Straczynski's wife, is official canon, 100% complete from beginning to end. It's considered official canon of the story. It tells us some of the aftermath of Sinclair's story. It tells us of the early days of Marcus, and it gives us the final resolution on Catherine Sakai's character. So if you're a Babylon 5 fan and you have not read it, definitely read To Dream in the City of Sorrows.
I'll need to do that.
So what were your thoughts, Jim, on The Gathering? You've given a summary, but what were your thoughts on the show?
I liked it a lot. I liked the story. I liked the exposition, getting to know some of the characters. I thought the character development for the main cast that actually came back was done quite well, so that when the series did get started up, I did recognize everybody. They were still themselves. I just really, really liked the big vistas of the inside of the station that they shot while they were doing that, and you really got a sense of scope, especially when they were riding the
Core shuttle?
Yes, the core shuttle back and forth, and you could see how big this thing really was inside.
5 miles long.
Yeah, and had some real girth to it too, because the inside shell had environment.
It had farmland. Yeah, they grew crops.
Yes, it looked very realistic. I think, being it had been so long since I watched that particular episode, some of the makeup job was pretty didn't really impress me at all.
I can give them a little slack on the makeup, being not quite up to the finished look that we saw when the series started. simply because what they were trying to accomplish with it. They didn't want to put a little nose piece on or bob the ears. Their aliens really had a much more alien look to them.
Right.
And one of the things I noticed, let's think of it this way. There was lots and lots of exposition, like you said.
Yes.
The Gathering is not a fast-paced show. It's a lot of exposition, and they're establishing at least the key parts of the Babylon 5 mythology, at least the parts that you need to be able to follow the series at all. That's one advantage that Star Trek, and this is one of the things that Joseph Brzezinski himself has talked about. You don't want to compare the two. Star Trek is this well-established mythology. You come into a new Star Trek series, you don't have to explain what a phaser is.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of have to figure out what a PPG is by contrast.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So, it's the establishment of that. It was establishing, as you said, of the main characters. So it's a little bit of a slower episode than what you typically expect out of a pilot.
Mm-hmm. But the story was still good. It held up well throughout, and then in the last half hour picked up a whole lot.
It definitely picked up. Yes, that's when it picked up the steam. And that was one of the things I actually liked about it. It didn't feel like it had to rush through everything. One of the areas that I'm a little more critical of modern storytelling is far too often they sacrifice time for quality.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to get this fast. We have to have lots of booms, lots of bangs, lots of flat, and they need to take time to tell the story. When they did this in Babylon 5, this was something I thought was a bit of a problem 20 years ago. When I say modern, I'm talking even back in the 90s. When they did this as an intro for Babylon 5, I didn't see the first time it aired. I saw the re-airing of it before the series itself. And I'll be honest, I was an in and out spotty watcher of the series for the first half of the first season. At first, the initial series, I didn't think was living up to some of the promise in the pilot, because what I saw in the pilot was this grand, huge universe, this grand, huge room for story. They weren't sitting in a ship zipping from here to there where something would happen, yay, everything's reset at the end of the episode, not procedural. It had this, there was just a scale to the pilot that I hadn't seen before. And let's be honest, the first half of that first season was kind of episodic. If I missed it, no big deal. If I got it, okay, nice, good story.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until later when the presidential election started to build up, there were people starting to question who's doing what's going on here. You saw some more of the tension between the Narn and Centauri, and it's like, okay, now we've got a story here. And that's when I got much more involved. And then, of course, this is something people from the 21st century might not remember much of, but back at one time in the 90s, there was something called repeats or reruns. When you missed the episode, when the season was over, they would rerun the episodes, or at least part of. They didn't put some sort of filler series or a mini series or whatever, and you got repeats of the episode. If you missed one, you were able to catch up. Of course, that's because 20 years ago, everyone didn't have DVRs or Hulu or Amazon or whatever to catch up on old episodes.
That's correct. We live in a charmed society.
We were talking about characters a little earlier. What about the characters? I know, and you and I have talked about this before. Probably the most changed character going from the pilot to the series was obviously Delenn.
Oh, yeah. Her makeup on the pilot
was terrible.
Well, it was. She looked like a guy.
Well, that wasn't entirely an accident, though. They were trying to give her an androgynous feel, if not fully male, at least somewhat hermaphroditic. And when she went through some of her changes, then she would be making a change to more distinctly female.
Right.
But the bone crest was it something that she stuck on her head, or was it something that was a natural growth? For you couldn't tell. In fact, there was a few scenes where you could actually kind of see through it.
Yeah, it was. You couldn't tell whether it was an appliance that she put on. You couldn't tell if it was part of her anatomy. The nose piece was all wrong, and her chin was, well, it looked like a guy's chin.
And it didn't look all that real.
No.
When you see Delenn in full Minbari mode in the series, it's completely different. It's a completely different feel.
Yeah. See, I just before we started recording, I watched this again, and Diane, my wife, had mentioned that Delenn looked plastic.
Yes, very plasticky. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, it was an unsolicited remark on her part, so she kind of picked up on that right away. I think it disappointed me because we know that this actress is absolutely a beautiful woman, and to cover that up, that must have been quite a job.
Yeah, absolutely. Another look that didn't change as much, but really deserves some mentioning, is Londo and the Centauri and the whole hair crest.
Yeah.
That was actually started as a joke. Joe Straczynski was working on the look for the Centauri, working on the look for Londo, and Peter Jurasik had sort of made this joke about, I want this big hair and Straczynski thought he was serious. It's like, okay, the actors, I've got to respect the actor and give him what he wants, so he put it into the script, and they were stuck with it as a result.
Yeah, and in this pilot episode, the hair looked unkempt.
Much more unkempt, yes.
Yeah, it didn't have that same look. It looked like it went up at more of an angle, so it looked more like a half-open fan.
I have seen some discussions with the crew that it was like 3 seasons before they finally got the hair to look even remotely like what they really wanted.
Well, and then there was Jakar.
Right.
His makeup changed quite a bit. I was looking for that in the show this evening. His chin came down to a flat place, and he didn't have the spots, and his skin had more of a
reptilian.
I don't know.
It was more reptilian, more sharp and angular rather than the more salamander type feel that he had.
Well, there was I remember watching on the series, and as I had watched it several times, there were 2 spots on his chin in particular. And I would, every show when Jakar would come on, I would check to make sure that they stayed in the same place. That they were consistent with that.
Right.
And they were.
Now, one thing about Jakar's character that was introduced that didn't change was, let's just say, some of his appetites. He was as hedonistic as Malari, actually probably more so than Malari.
Yeah, he definitely had a look at Lita Alexander and knew what direction he wanted to go in with her. And
he took interspecies relations to a whole new level.
And couched it in a research project.
Well, that research project actually turns out to be one of those plot elements that is important, because this is where it serves the purpose of letting us know that there are no Narn telepaths. Of all the main sentient species, Narns are the only ones that do not have telepaths, and it turns out there's a reason for that.
Well, I don't think Jakar's motivation was purely empirical.
No, there was nothing platonic about it at all.
No.
That really covers the races introduced at this point. And we don't see very many representatives of those races.
No. The only one that we didn't mention yet, though, was the Vorlons, Kosh, and his role in this thing.
Was mostly laying around on a gurney, unconscious, unfortunately.
And making everybody wonder what he looked like under that environment suit.
Exactly. And that is actually what you just mentioned there. Remember in your summary, that poison tab was slapped onto his hand. A lot of people thought that, well, wait a second, there's a inconsistency and a plot hole. How did he have if he's got that encounter suit, how did he have a hand? Well, you've got to remember, Lita, doing that scan, she told them in advance that, no, I'll be able to see what happens, but it's going to be through her point of view, from her perspective. So that was actually Lita's hand that you saw.
Right.
So Kosh did have something that stuck out to allow that poisoning.
Yes.
We kind of find out a little more about what that's going to be like, and we find out why we're not allowed to see what a Vorlon looks like in his countersuit.
Right.
But that said, we learn in the third season that Kosh was aware of the direction Sinclair's story would take, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means Kosh knew Sinclair, even though Sinclair hadn't known Kosh yet at the time of the gathering.
Right.
So did Kosh allow that poisoning to happen?
I don't know. I suppose he could have, knowing, of course, that he would survive.
Right. When you look further into the series and see how the series is developed, obviously Kosh knows more about what's going on than anyone has any idea.
Well, how about this idea, though? We don't know anything about the Vorlons.
Not at this point.
And we put a poison patch on him. Perhaps he wasn't actually poisoned. Perhaps he was just playing his role in this, and he wasn't actually poisoned. I mean, how do we?
In order to allow what has to happen to happen.
Right, and he was just. Who knows? He could have produced any number of results on the doctor's instruments.
That is entirely true. One other thing to note about Kosh, in spite of the changes from being in Lita's point of view, the hand did still have that, I guess, angelic is a good word to choose there. It still had that angelic glow to it. So, yeah, there's definitely more than meets the eye.
And this brings us kind of to a point that we've talked about and has been mentioned, the difference between the pilot that I saw and the director's cut. And I'll let you take this one.
Well, from what I understand, your version did not have any lines from Kosh in it.
There were none whatsoever. Sinclair came in. He said, "Welcome to Babylon 5." He leaned forward and put his hand out. The scene cut down to the hands. Lita's hand came out. They grasped hands. Sinclair slapped this green patch on the back of her hand and held it there. And that was it.
The same thing happens on the DVD, except Kosh does have a line. When he first sees Sinclair, he says, "Until Za Valen." That is a huge setup for the entire Sinclair arc.
And at this point, of course, we don't know what Entil Za means, and we also don't know who Valen is.
Or what. We don't even know if it's a who or a what.
Exactly. So, we've got something that's been dropped that's going to get resolved in the future.
Or in the past.
Okay. All right, you got me on that one.
I couldn't resist. Sorry.
But at the same time, a person who would be watching this for the very first time would have no reference.
They would have
to understanding what that is.
They would have no idea what's up or what's coming. we've gone through what we've learned about the characters, and yes, we've learned a lot about the characters, but in learning about those characters, we've also learned a lot about their backgrounds, the backgrounds of their people as well. And
Hmm.
that kind of serves a fairly critical role. Uh, the Centauri, for example, Londo really has a buffoon, and that is, I think, a phrase that Straczynski used in some of his discussions, a buffoon role in the pilot and in the first season, in fact.
Hmm.
But that's also, that's also largely a description of the Centauri people as well. He keeps referring back to the great old days. He does it in a way that, yes, it's very comic, but there's sort of a tragic aspect to it as well, I think.
Yeah, it's Malari's costume. He's very they are very foppish, 19th century, trying to they have this huge society, space going society. They're everywhere, and all of a sudden they're nothing anymore probably because they've blown all their resources fighting wars.
Particularly with the Narn,
Yes,
which is the next group of people that you probably want to bring up.
yes.
We get it established that the Narn have been enslaved by the Centauri for a rather long time.
And when Delenn says that to Jakar, he corrects her very quickly,
Yeah, she touched a
saying,
nerve.
"We were not enslaved; we were conquered."
Right. In that same conversation, we also see a characteristic. Turns out that to be something that largely describes the Narn. There's almost an obsession with power, with acquiring power, and I think that's partly to do because of their conquered status for so long. It's sort of the never again,
Yes.
and that drives a lot of what they do.
Do we have any background canon or non-canon what set these two societies against each other?
No, just the fact that the Centauri, just the nature of the two people, the Centauri were an expansive people. They romped among the stars, conquering as they went. And as you get into the series, you kind of get a feel of Imperial Rome. Actually, today
Uh,
it's less of, well, the old days of Centauri would be more like Imperial Rome at its expansion and at its greatest. And now you've got them in collapse.
well, it almost doesn't seem as much Roman to me as it does British. Their big colonizing period where the Romans just went in and they didn't care what you were doing. They just took your resources.
Well, that's
The
largely what the
British,
Centauri seem to do.
the British tried to help develop societies and help instill them with their values and their way of doing things. They tried to re-educate people.
That's what the Centauri claimed. But when you look at
Hmm.
their action, especially as it goes through the further action of the Earth Centauri or the Narn Centauri War, the second one, they claim that that's what they're doing. But when we finally
Yeah.
get to Narn itself and see what's happening, it's just brutal enslavement.
Oh, well, I didn't see it as enslavement as much as I did genocide.
Yeah, that's it. It's to some degree kind of amounted to that.
Pretty much, yeah. But that's a discussion for down the road
Yep,
a piece.
definitely. And in fact, it'll be multiple discussions down the road. But what's
Oh
but
yes.
what's great is we get to see we see the seeds of this laid out, at least the
Hmm.
initial, and likewise with the Minbari too.
Yeah. But the funny thing though in the pilot was the way that Londo caved in to Jakar when it came down to voting for extraditing Sinclair or not. Malari just seemed completely deflated, completely defeated, and pretty much at Jakar's mercy.
Based on the information that Jakar had.
Well, and not only that, but the actor portrayed a like I really don't care, as long as I get my piece of the action here. He didn't seem to offer any argument.
Like when he discussed what happened with Garibaldi a little bit later, and Garibaldi asks him, "Well, would it have changed anything if you knew, as far as it was being a setup?"
Right, and he said no.
Okay, so the Minbari. What did we learn about the Minbari? We know Delenn's there to watch over Sinclair for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
We know that Delenn seems to be a little more familiar with the Vorlons than she lets on. At least that's what we...
Right.
At least that's... When you look at them in the very last scene, introducing each other, that you kind of get that idea.
Mm-hmm.
We find out Minbari society is based on castes.
Right.
And that the Minbari that's involved in the plot is from the warrior caste.
Right.
And by the way, did you know that the particular clan of the warrior caste he's from, we find out at some point, and actually I think this might be in the commentary of the DVD, is that it's from the Windswords clan.
Ah, yeah, I recall that.
The Windswords are the same clan that gave sanctuary to Deathwalker. So it comes back to haunt a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, and we find out a little bit about the Great Council, at least that it exists.
And then we find out that Delenn has certain powers that are only shown this time, and they don't come back.
The rings.
Yeah, her ring collection, the one, and she put the one red one on her finger, and caused Jakar a great deal of discomfort.
Gravity control. Yeah, it was a gravity control ring.
Yes.
Those were dropped going into the main series because Straczynski basically decided they were just too darn powerful. Mm-hmm. So he just wrote them out.
And I think that was a good thing.
I agree completely.
It seemed awfully mystical.
Far too much so. Yeah, that was probably one of the better changes that was made going from pilot to series, above and beyond the makeup. And last but not least, we do get the Psi Corps introduced.
Oh, yes.
Very superficially, and probably we see only as much of it as most people from Earth at the time would see. The good side, the side connected with business. We see nothing of the sinister that will be involved later on in the series.
Yeah, the manipulative side of it. One thing that I thought was interesting there were Lita's gloves. You notice that she was reluctant to take them off at all because they are not allowed to touch people with their bare skin.
Right, but that's primarily because the direct physical contact increases that telepathic connection.
And she only removed her gloves in order to have a better connection with Kosh.
Uh-huh. And that's, I think, sets up something else that will come to fruition a little further along in the series as well. That there is some sort of bond between Kosh and Lita.
Which would be logical. She was the only person to have direct contact with him.
All right, we're both in agreement that we did not like the rings. Was there anything else? And we've spent most of the last hour talking about all the things we did like. Was there anything else that you particularly didn't like?
Yeah.
You mentioned Delenn's makeup already.
Right. Our second in command. I think she acted it well. She seemed a little stiff in her role. I felt like she was delivering... Well, I'll put it this way. When Susan Ivanova came along, I think she fit what Straczynski's vision was for that role a whole lot better than Tamlin did. Because she was trying to deliver the same kinds of lines. You know, would you like me to send them flowers?
Or the
you
coffee.
know, yeah, trying to be, a smarty, and she didn't deliver it that well.
In fact, Claudia Christian playing Ivanova has almost the same dialogue about coffee with Corwin, I think in the second or third season, as Laurel has with Benjamin Kyle in the pilot.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ivanova conversation comes off perfect. In comparison, Laurel, like you said, was just stiff and stilted.
Yeah. Well, I sure could not see her doing at all there was no boom today. No boom today.
Oh, gosh, no.
Boom tomorrow. There's always going to be. It would not have worked.
No,
okay?
it just wouldn't.
And I'm not going to directly out and spoil it, but you remember what she said she should have done for Marcus Cole?
Yep.
That would have not.
That
worked
line would not have
all.
worked at all. You're absolutely right.
So I think that was a really good move, that she probably realized she wasn't going to fit what was being asked of her there.
Correct. And if I had to pick on my side, if I had to pick a character that just didn't cut it for me, as I've already mentioned, it'd have to be Carolyn. And I don't know why. That's the part about I can't place it. And it's not because I saw the main series and liked how they took it to be. There was just something, I don't know, it just seemed like there wasn't a chemistry between the two. It wasn't a solid connection.
Well, do you think perhaps that might have worked itself out? Again, as I watched this evening, I didn't care for her character because of the coming and going thing. And she seemed to be thrown in there as part of the script in order to explain where this very rare poison that Sinclair supposedly used on Kosh, that she was the one who brought it to the station.
She was only there as a plot device.
Yeah, I'm wondering if perhaps that may be what put you off a little bit.
That very well may have.
Because when we get Carolyn during the regular series,
You mean Catherine?
Or Catherine, yes. When we get Catherine during the regular season or regular series, we get way more background on that these two people had a whole lot of history. It's a little more developed.
Right.
And that they get together and they stay together a while and it doesn't work out, so they split up. But they can't, and even Catherine got married, didn't she, at one point?
I don't
remember. And then divorced, and then came back. I think I recall that. And
it might have been as a mention.
So I perhaps if there were some better plot or better character development there, and not just her as part of a convenient part of the story, I think perhaps might have been better.
Think everything that you've said may be part of it. I've been thinking it through as I listen to you talk, and I think I know what it is. Catherine, there's a feistiness to Catherine Sakai. Not just the strong woman. There was a type of snarky feistiness that Catherine had that Carolyn just absolutely did not. I mean, it was still a strong female role, but it didn't have that feistiness, and that is something that really appealed to me.
Well, Catherine was a character who had to have her independence. She was her own person, and her one weakness was Sinclair.
Right.
Otherwise, she would have been absolutely flawless.
That gets back to, folks, you've got to read To Dream in the City of Sorrows. Must-read book if you're a Catherine Sinclair fan at all.
I promise I will.
when you can squeeze it in between chapters of Dune.
Oh boy. That's a rough one.
Right.
And just to mention quickly, along with this podcast, I'm also a regular host, co-host on the Dune Saga podcast, so that may come out every once in a while.
You know, Jim, I think we've
Yeah.
pretty much talked this pilot to death. And I know, folks, we're a little more scattered about than those of you who have heard us on other podcasts, but it's sort of a reflection of the nature of this particular episode. It's a wide net that's introducing a lot of characters, trying to introduce a lot of backgrounds, trying to introduce entire races, trying to set up the beginnings of a very, very complex and detailed story. And they're trying to do that in an hour and 40 minutes. What would be a 2 hour, well, maybe an hour and a half, but a very short period of time compared to 5 years of 22 episodes per season.
Right.
That said, I think they did it successfully. It certainly left some very big questions for us. We've talked about Kosh's hand and what's inside the Vorlon shell already, but that's not the entirety of it. One question that becomes a key one for an episode in season 1. Why was Amir Commander given such a high-profile assignment? And let's face it, Babylon 5 was a big station, 250,000 people. It was basically the UN, and
Right.
a middle-rank naval officer was put in charge of the entire thing. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Why? What's up?
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Yes, we'll find that out. And then also, during the show was mentioned Babylon's 1, 2, 3, and 4. How were the first 3 destroyed? We know they were destroyed, but we don't know how. And Babylon 4 just simply dissolved and went away.
Right after it went online.
Which is another point we're going to learn
Eventually.
down the road a piece. Yes.
In and out as time goes by.
Right.
And there is definitely some sort of, it's a little more out in front on the version of the pilot that you saw, but there's definitely
Right.
some sort of darker conspiracy that connects some, at least in Narn. It connects at least some of those on Earth. Obviously, Del Varna was involved with something on it. And at least the Windswords clan, if nothing else, of the Minbari. So what is this big dark conspiracy?
Mm-hmm.
And
these are, that again is going to be addressed a little bit later on.
why go more than a little bit? That becomes a key plot fact of the story,
Yes.
a key plot arc.
And then there is what the Minbari warrior, when he was thrown against the power grid and it shorted out the shapeshifter net that he was wearing, and Sinclair wants to know what he's doing there, and he simply says to him, "There is a hole in your mind." Sinclair doesn't know what that means.
We don't know what it means.
So that will be huge. And funny how all these little ideas that we just talked about are going to be tied up in a single part of this story.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And yet, some of the pieces that seem a little more, I mean, and you're right, some of those parts are the really big, obvious questions, and they'll be cleared up by season 3. Yet, other parts of these that seem smaller, I mean, a lot of people might not catch on to the idea of the extent of this conspiracy that's going on off the pilot. But if you watch the pilot after watching the first couple seasons, you're going to look back and say, ooh, he set this up. He set this up way back then.
I can just see it just blowing me away and saying, oh, wow, we got this way back in the pilot already. So,
well, remember, Straczynski had the entire series planned out from the start. Now, he had backdoors. He had ways to replace characters. Now, he didn't have everything written A to Z, And if you've ever done any writing, you know that doesn't happen. But he had the plot outline that he could sit down and he could write. There were no reasons to go through and do these ridiculous retcons that you see in some series. He was able to just progress the series forward and let it evolve itself, the same way you'd write a novel.
Yes.
Well, I think that covers as much as I've got to say about The Gathering. Any final comments or thoughts from you, sir?
Yeah, after not seeing it for many, many years, it was like watching it all over again. I didn't remember a lot of that stuff. So it was kind of neat to go back and rewatch.
Absolutely. That, more than anything else, it really got me excited about doing this podcast. It's going to be a fun 110 episodes.
Yes.
Well, Jim, before we go, why don't you let us know where we can find you and what some of the little projects and little interesting tidbits you've got going on?
Well, other than being a husband and a dad and K-12 music teacher during the day, I'm a sci-fi fan for the rest of the time, my waking hours. I do maintain a blog when I have time to sit down and write. I review books, movies. Once in a while, I'll review a podcast or something. It is called Jim's Sci-Fi Blog, and you can find that at jimssci-fi.blogspot.com. Okay, and then I also am part of the hosting crew for the Dune Saga podcast, along with David Moulton and Scott Herzog, two really good friends, and we do about one show a month where we thoroughly discuss the whatever book we happen to be reading. And then, of course, here on this new show with Raul, another really good friend, someone I've gotten to know over the interwebs and enjoy spending time with.
Amen to that, my friend. And for me, you hear me in and out on different podcasts. Jim and I are both frequent contributors as far as emails and voicemails and guest appearances on the Sci-Fi Diner. So you might run into me there. You can also find me at my blog, which is The Christian Geek, www.thechristiangeek.net. And that's a place where I discuss everything from apologetics to geek tech. I'm the 50-year-old old fuddy-duddy that the 20-somethings come to when they want to find out how to make their tech work. Some discussions on sound and pro audio, though I haven't written as much there. And, of course, a fairly hefty section on science fiction. And you can find us both on Facebook. Feel free to say hello to us there. You can find me as Raul Wybera on Facebook. And you can find me as RY Tech Geek on Twitter. And I believe, Jim, you would show up on both of those places as well.
Yeah, just my name, Jim Arrowwood, on Facebook. And then my Twitter handle is at Jim Arrowwood2. We do have a Gmail address.
And that is the Babylon Project Podcast at gmail.com. Well, Jim, I think we have covered everything tonight. I hope you had as much fun with this as I did.
Oh, I had a blast.
And
Thanks.
I sure hope the listeners enjoyed it as well. So let's go ahead and say goodbye and sign off for now.
All right. Have a great evening.
And remember, no boom today, boom tomorrow. There's always a boom
There's
tomorrow.
always a boom tomorrow.
You got it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Podcast terminated. Thank you for listening to the Babylon Project Podcast. You can email Raul and Jim at the Babylon Project Podcast at gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at the Babylon Project Podcast. On the internet, we are at babylonprojectpodcast.wordpress.com. To subscribe to the podcast, you can find us on iTunes, or you can subscribe to the RSS feed on the webpage.